This lesson is going to be looking at what a peer review is and why we need one in psychology. Psychology is considered a science, so we need every step in place to ensure that it continues to be recognised as a science, and peer review is one of the ways that we can do that. So what is an actual peer review? Well, a peer review is when a paper, a psychological paper, is sent to psychological experts who will independently scrutinise that paper. So if I was running a study now, I'd run the study, I'd have done the experiment, I would have got all my findings, I would have done my conclusion. But before that can be published in a psychological paper, I've got to send it off to a peer review panel. And that peer review panel will be made up of psychological experts who will look over my paper to make sure that it's good enough to be published in the journal. Really, it's an assessment of the scientific work. Okay, it's assessing scientific work by experts in that particular field. So there's an awful lot of things that happen within a peer review, and there are a lot of reasons why we need one in psychology. And the first thing they're doing is they're checking the validity of the study. Is the study measuring what it's supposed to measure? Does it have ecological validity? Does it have population validity? Or if it lacks validity, then that's something that might need to be changed by the researcher. What it really does is it acts as a filter for all bad research. There are going to be bad studies that are done out there. They all receive funding, all these studies, but they're not all going to be completed to the same level as each other. So what a peer review does is it allows psychologists and psychological experts to filter out any bad research. So that research can't get into the public domain, it can't be published, and the information won't get out there. So it acts as a filter for any bad research. It also allows the psychological experts to assess the quality of the methodology being used, the design of the study, how it's been carried out. Has that study been conducted in a way that reaches the high standards set by the British Psychological Society? They also judge the importance of that bit of research. Is it an original piece of research, or is it something that will just be copied over and over again, or it has been copied over and over again? So is it new and original, or has it been copied again and again? And they'll judge the importance of that research. Is it worth publicating this particular bit of work? Also, they'll then, once we've had the peer review, and once all these different things have been checked, the validity, the filtering for bad research, checking the design and methodology, making sure it's original, what they'll do is they will then either recommend it to be published or to be reviewed by the researcher itself. So they'll either take the paper, publish it straight into a journal, which then becomes access to everybody, or they'll send it back to the researcher and say, you need to make these changes to your study. So this little cartoon here gives you a bit of an idea of what a psychological peer review might look like. We've got our man at the bottom here who has just completed his paper. So he's got it in his hand and he's got to go through this peer review process. And the peer review process is a little bit like a gauntlet. So you've got some people here that will check the validity of the paper. Some of them will act as a filter and the poor research gets eliminated. They'll check the objectivity. Has the researcher been objective in what they're doing? They'll also check replicability. Can we repeat this study and get the same results? They'll check for weaknesses, and then they'll either send it back to the researcher, or they might accept it and the paper goes through and it gets published. So there are a lot of different things that happen with this peer review, and it's all about ensuring that only the highest standard of research manages to get through and be published, because that keeps psychology in that scientific bracket. If we're making sure all the research that gets produced and published is at the highest level, then we're meeting the criteria to be a science. So if we were to break it down, there are three main purposes of a peer review. The first one will be the allocation of research funding. So it ensures that money is only spent on worthwhile projects. So before some studies are done, they'll be put forward to an independent peer review board. And from here, the review board will be able to select which studies require funding and which ones don't. So it ensures that only the best research actually gets the funding that it requires. Secondly, it ensures that only the best data and accurate data is published in journals. It prevents any faulty data, any inaccurate data entering the public domain. So once a study is actually published in a journal, that becomes access to everybody. You can get it on the internet, you can go away and find it in a journal. And what the peer review does is it makes sure that all the studies that are published are of a very, very high standard. Remember, psychology is regarded as a science, so we need to make sure all research done stays at a really high level. And thirdly, is to suggest any amendments or improvement. So once the peer review is done, they might send it back to the researcher to make tiny changes, or potentially they might deem the research unworthy and ask it to be withdrawn. So these are the three main purposes of a peer review. So peer reviews, then, what it does, it ensures that the paper and psychology itself has integrity. Okay, and that we maintain the highest standards set by science. Also, it makes sure that the research can be taken seriously. And finally, that a paper can be published in a well-respected journal. That once that data is in there, and if we read it, we can be sure that it's been through a peer review process and that it will be accurate, reliable, valid research. And we can take those findings and use them as we wish. So we're going to have a quick look at the evaluation, the AO3 for a peer review. And one of the main issues with it is that sometimes it's not possible to find a psychological expert for a particular field. It might be a very small niche field where there aren't that many experts actually in that particular area. So any peer review board that's going to be looking at the study might not know enough about that particular area in order to make amendments to it. And this means sometimes that studies that aren't up to the highest possible standard or aren't completely accurate in their information might slip through the net. Secondly is this idea of anonymity. And peer reviewers are anonymous. They're completely anonymous, they're supposed to be completely independent. However, in psychology, this can mean that sometimes someone on a peer review board or conducting a peer review can use this process to bury rival research. If you're a psychologist and you're competing with maybe another university for funding in a particular area, then if you get that person's paper from the other university, then you might not want it to be published. The more that university gets something published, the more funding they're going to get, the less funding you're likely to get. So it is possible that psychologists abuse the system of peer review and ensure that they get any grants for themselves. So they do this habit of burying their rivals' research. And finally is the idea of publication bias. Journals want to publish positive results. Not all studies are going to show a positive result. Some are going to show there is no relationship between things. And that's really important research as well. But journals want these big positive headline studies that we found something and it's exciting and it's new. And that can result in a publication bias because not every study that in that particular area will be getting released into the public domain. So there is a publication bias because they want positive news most of the time.